All right. So hello everyone and welcome to IISD's webinar on the economic risks and opportunity costs facing LNG exporting countries. So my name is Stephen Haig. I'm a policy advisor at IISD and I'll be facilitating today's session. I'm also happy to be joined by our three expert speakers, Ian Sanderson, Shannon Baker-Brandstetter, and Mark Olga, representing the Pembina Institute, the Centre for American Progress, and the Australia Institute, respectively. So before we jump into it, though, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, this session is being recorded and it will be shared afterwards. Second, we will have 3 consecutive presentations followed by around 15 minutes of audience Q&A. We're looking forward to a good discussion today, so please be active in asking any questions that come to mind. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions throughout the session. Either for the panel as a whole or any individual speaker, and we will address as many as we can after the presentations. I'll also note that this is the second webinar in a 2-part series, with the previous installment focusing on Canada's LNG subsidies and energy security concerns for importers, which I'll speak a little bit about now. So before handing over to our excellent speakers today, I'll set the scene and outline the key takeaways from our previous webinar. So as many of you know, Canada's first large-scale LNG export facility, LNG Canada Phase 1, began operations earlier this year. 5 other projects in BC are at various stages of development as well. The largest of these, LNG Canada Phase 2, was recently listed as a project of national interest by the federal government, opening the door to further potential financial and or regulatory support. Details unconfirmed. So what's more is that recent research from IISD has shown that the governments of BC and Canada have already allocated almost 4 billion Canadian dollars by the end of 2030 in support of this nascent LNG industry. Research by IISD and others also warns that Canadian LNG faces a precarious and highly competitive market. So we could see a significant supply glut beginning as early as next year as massive new supply comes online, especially in the US and Qatar, while many importers begin to move away from LNG and towards cleaner and cheaper alternatives like renewables. Indeed, in IISD's previous LNG webinar, we heard from experts on Asian and European LNG markets, with the common themes being that LNG's high and volatile pricing has driven many buyers, especially in emerging economies, to shift away from the imported fossil fuel on grounds of energy security. With this in mind, Canada faces a fork in the road, with the opportunity to either double down on fossil fuel production or to align its industrial policy with shifting global markets and the clean energy transition. As such, we're here today to discuss how LNG exports may affect Canadians right here at home, both in terms of direct economic costs and missed opportunities. To help, we have experts from 2 of the world's largest LNG exporters, the US and Australia, to explain the economic impacts that LNG production has had on their domestic economies, with key takeaways for Canada. But first, I'm happy to introduce Ian Sanderson, Senior Analyst at the Pembina Institute, to present new research on the opportunity costs in terms of GDP and jobs that could come from investing in LNG expansion and electrification instead of other industries more aligned with the clean energy transition. Over to you, Ian.
Perfect. Just confirming, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, well, Stephen gave me quite the introduction there. And so my name is Ian Sanderson. I'm a senior analyst at the Pembina Institute. Excited to be here today to present to you some preliminary findings from an upcoming report that we have at the Pembina Institute with my colleague Will and myself, looking at the economic trade-offs of LNG and exploring the opportunity costs of LNG electrification of LNG in BC. So Stephen did a very good job of covering the LNG market, and I promise we didn't copy each other. But as Stephen mentioned, Canada's really just emerging as an LNG exporting nation. There's currently only the one project. If we look on the map there, that's LNG Canada up in Kitimat in northern BC. Two other facilities under construction, that's Cedar and Woodfibre. They're much smaller facilities. And then you've got three other potential projects that are at various stages of FID. And so really BC finds itself right now at a point of how much do we develop? And some of these projects, as mentioned, they have the necessary approvals in place, but the industry has not taken the final investment decision on them. And we would say that's largely due to the economic headwinds, as was covered in the first part of this series. But yes, to reiterate, the glut of supply that's coming on from expanding US export capacity, as well as demand out of the Asian markets that is not materializing. And also, interestingly, to me, as the story of it as a transition fuel and seeing that emerging Asian economies are actually not switching to LNG, and that's because of the cost of it, and it's not cost competitive with coal or renewables now. So we're not seeing this transition take place in the emerging markets that the industry had maybe banked on or has promoted. And this is a problem for Canada because Canada, it has to compete on, and I'll use the pejorative air quotes, story of being clean LNG, as it is a relatively high cost producer. And in order to give itself that title, it requires electrification using BC Hydro's clean power. BC has substantial amounts of hydroelectric power, and these terminals require on substantial amounts of electricity in order to compress and cool the gas before shipping it. And so if they do not have this clean power, then they are forced to use typically natural gas in order to do this. And so again, to say that BC is really at an inflection point now of how many of these new projects should it develop and the question of electrifying them or not. And so this got us thinking about what are the actual opportunity costs of continuing to develop LNG. And this is really thinking about electricity as a scarce resource. There is, as I mentioned, substantial amounts of hydroelectric power in BC, and a large part of that has already been committed to LNG projects in BC, as was again covered in the first part of this series. They've also received substantial subsidies to the tune of 681 million for electricity infrastructure towards LNG. And this really risks crowding out potentially other sectors. I'll use the word future facing, but I mean, there's all sorts of energy transition aligned, you could say. These sectors are also in search of clean power, and for Canada to compete to attract these businesses, it also should be thinking about these things. So this leads to a resource allocation decision. So British Columbia needs to decide how much electricity and how to expand its LNG infrastructure, and versus investing or prioritizing emerging and energy transition aligned sectors. And again, this isn't to say that we are at Pembina Institute are opposed to electrifying LNG, but there's large emission implications if these things are not electrified. We estimate that the LNG operations could generate up to 25 megatons annually if they're not electrified. So in order to do this, we constructed a few scenarios based on the most recent calls for power from BC Hydro. So we used the 2024-25 calls for electricity or new generation capacity, as well as the Site C dam, which just came online, and the potential of a new intertie for Alberta to sort of create this resource constraint of our new addition of clean power. And to give context for how much electricity the industry actually requires, an estimate for if you were to partially electrify all of the upstream required to supply 5 new terminals, it would be almost double the new supply that is projected to be or has come online and will be coming online. So from that, we constructed 3 scenarios, one an LNG focused, where we have electrified as much of the upstream as possible while fully electrifying 4 of the terminals, and LNG Canada's phase 1 is partially electrified. Then the other ones, we've instead looked at, again, considering this is a scarce resource, and allocated some of that power to other sectors. We looked at critical mineral mines, battery plants, data centers, and electrification of ports, but you could think of other sectors as well. And in the mixed growth scenario, we've still electrified all 5 terminals, but not electrified the upstream. And diversified instead, we say, you know what, maybe we should just only develop the ones that are under construction and continue the operation of LNG Canada phase 1. So to look at the these preliminary results from our input-output analysis, we estimate that the opportunity cost of focusing specifically on LNG would be potentially to the tune of 6 billion and about 8,000 direct jobs. And this is a per year of operation. What this really shows is that some of these other sectors offer much more GDP impacts and employment impacts when we think about it on a per megawatt hour basis. And the other interesting thing from this is showing that really most of the benefits are from the upstream development, particularly from the GDP perspective. And actually, the risks are much larger with upstream development when it comes to emissions, when we look at the BC economy or Canada's emission targets. Also, too, long-term, the benefits of LNG are somewhat limited. The job prospects are actually not that substantial when we look at the operation of these facilities over the long term. And also the revenue is less certain in that it relies heavily on royalties, which obviously, again, are subject to market volatility. So moving beyond the operational impacts, maybe to sort of the qualitative aspects of diversification, Canada is currently in a trade war with our neighbors to the south, and is looking at broadening its economy and diversifying it into various sectors. So as our results show that moving into these say diversified sectors offers not only the benefits of diversification, moving away from being exposed to only one sector, also shifting capital into higher productive, again, using the term future-facing sectors, while also driving innovation. And this should help reduce risks. One of the big risks that come with LNG development and oil and gas infrastructure is stranded assets. And with, again, the market risks that both myself and Stephen covered, these large facilities run the risk of being abandoned at the end of the day and left either with the government being left to clean up for it or left abandoned. And we've seen this play out in Alberta with the Orphan Well Association there. And last, kind of tying into the first, is that capturing more of the value chain, moving simply beyond the extraction and into processing and manufacturing, where we actually capture more of the GDP impacts, and particularly prioritizing sectors that have higher domestic value add. And that's what we see here with the thought of, say, developing not only the critical minerals, but also the battery manufacturing facilities together. So if I was to leave you with one thing today, to say that we're not opposed here at Pembina to electrifying LNG, for sure. That's not what I want to say, but that we should be thinking critically about the trade-offs when developing LNG, with market risks, the potential for stranded assets, and the emission implications. We would argue that there's other sectors that offer more benefit, more jobs, and potentially a better outlook with lower risk when we consider clean electricity as a scarce resource or as an asset. And overcommitting to LNG, as results show, significant opportunity costs, and really risk crowding out some of these emerging sectors. So when it comes to making public financing decisions, we should be prioritizing industries that align with where the world is going. And also BC Hydro should be considering how it plans for prioritizing further types of industrial development. And that's it for me.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much, Ian, for that excellent presentation. While we get the next set of slides on the screen, I'll just note that it's great to start today's session with the fact that LNG is not the only option on the table for economic development in BC or Canada more generally. There are several, as your research shows, there are several other potentially even better options on the table to consider. So thanks for starting off the conversation there. And with that, I would like to pass the floor over to Shannon Baker-Brandstetter. They're the Senior Director for Domestic Climate and Energy Policy at the Center for American Progress, and will present research on the economic impacts of LNG expansion in the US. So over to you, Shannon.
Thank you, Stephen. Can you see my slides okay?
We can.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Baker-Brandstetter. I lead the domestic climate team at the Center for American Progress, which is a progressive think tank based in Washington, D.C. And earlier this year, we worked with a German think tank and partner on why LNG projects are a bad deal for Americans and Germans, as they were looking at LNG deals with the United States. So here I will just present kind of the American side of why LNG projects provide some definite downsides for Americans. So we are on the other end of sounds like what Canada is experimenting with or dipping its toe into. We just started LNG exports only a decade ago. It's hard to believe given how quickly they have risen, but it really comes at a tremendous cost to Americans' health, to our pocketbooks, and environmental quality generally. So what we've seen is that LNG projects expose the US customers to much higher prices because now natural gas, instead of just being produced and consumed in the US, now it's on the global market. And so spikes, whether that's from the Russian invasion of Ukraine or just growing demand, there's just a lot more exposure now in the US markets. And that has materialized into higher prices for electricity because a lot of gas is used for generating electricity in the US, as well as just for natural gas consumption for industrial, commercial, and residential use. We've also seen an increase in pollution from natural gas up and down the full life cycle chain, from fracking the gas in places like Pennsylvania, to the pipelines that leak, and then to the LNG facilities themselves have very high pollution rates. And these burdens are not shared equally across the US population. The LNG terminals in particular tend to be concentrated in low-income areas of color along the Gulf Coast. And we're also seeing a lot of the fracking impacts and pipeline impacts also disproportionately in low-income communities and communities of color. We've also seen President Trump use LNG as a form of coercive diplomacy and trying to negotiate deals and trying to force other countries to buy LNG from US companies. And we're also seeing that increase in LNG projections, if continuing unfettered, would erode climate goals and climate progress. So to add a few details on the increase in costs, US residential gas prices went up 40% over 5 years due to the rapid growth of LNG. As I mentioned, just the greater exposure for US customers, both businesses and households. The gas prices themselves went up significantly compared to 2020. And again, cited as natural gas supply squeeze from increased global demands. And what this adds up to is over $120 per year per household if LNG exports are continued to increase. And again, adding that up for consumers, it's over $14 billion. And then for businesses and manufacturers in particular, $125 billion by 2050. In terms of emissions, LNG projects, again, just really have a lot of harms up and down the life cycle. So traditionally, of course, we all know that methane has much greater warming power than CO2. And methane also tends to be much higher than the reporting that we see. So it's 8 times higher than industry targets for methane, and it's just a much higher leakage rate when it's actually measured in the field than is projected or recorded. And because of that, because of the fracking, because of the pipeline leaks, and because of the inefficiency of LNG production itself, LNG from the US equals or exceeds the greenhouse gas footprint of coal when you account for all those leaks. And then, as I mentioned before, the human toll, fracking-related pollution in particular in the Appalachian region, caused up to almost 5,000 premature deaths and associated higher health and climate costs totaling almost $60 billion. And then gas, of course, itself is very volatile and dangerous, and so the facilities can also have injuries and deaths. And we're seeing gas pipeline incidents in the US causing over a dozen deaths, 35 injuries, and almost 150 million in property damage just in 2024 alone. There have been some very high profile LNG facility explosions as well that have happened over the last several years that then bring the LNG facilities offline and are really harmful to workers. As I mentioned before, the inequitable burden is very apparent when you look at where most of the LNG facilities are located along the Gulf Coast, experiencing some of the highest premature death rates and much higher than average deaths per million in some of the parishes where these are growing the fastest. The economic benefits of LNG projects often bypass the communities that are in them, with the jobs necessarily not even being in the communities that are experiencing the highest pollution. And as I mentioned, the burden for people of color and communities of color is especially high, 170% higher for Black Americans and 129% higher for Hispanic Americans. So our policy recommendations that we made back in the spring, and granted this is during the Trump administration, so we don't expect these to be taken up anytime soon. But what we'd like to see is diplomacy that actually builds on trust and increases clean energy tech supply chains, works toward our joint climate goals, prioritizing clean energy, and really using diplomacy to support affordable clean energy and strengthen our alliances. And then the flip side of that is, of course, refraining from LNG expansion, since it does harm our decarbonization efforts and also increases the infrastructure that is locked in to natural gas for decades to come. And that's all I have for now. Happy to answer questions. And my colleague, Jasia Smith, is also on the line and will be helping answering questions as well.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Shannon, for sharing your research there. That's really helpful and interesting for us in Canada to learn from the experience of the US. So now, following in the same theme, we're going to shift from the US to Australia for another case study on how LNG expansion has affected households and businesses in LNG exporting countries. So to explain, we have Mark Carney, Principal Advisor to the Australia Institute, who is calling in very early in the morning from Victoria, Australia. So thanks for calling in, Mark, and take it away. You're muted at the moment.
Sorry about that. Can you see my slides? Can you see my slides there? Great. Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to speak. It's really interesting hearing the perspective from the US and Canada as well. And there's a lot of echoes with what we're seeing in Australia. So, given Australia is the third largest gas exporter in the world after the US and Qatar, you might be surprised to hear that we're about to start importing gas. What I've got here is can you see my cursor, by the way? It's just on this slide? Maybe not. So this is an energy flow, a gas flow diagram for Australia, and you can see on the left-hand side the inputs of the gas. So it's made up of partly coal seam gas, I think you call it coal bed methane, and then conventional gas, which is largely offshore, but also some onshore gas coming in on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see where the gas flows to. So 80% of the gas, and you can see it in the purple, is exported, and about 20% is used in the domestic economy. So gas is all about exports in Australia. Something interesting to look at, though, is that the next biggest use after exports is the LNG plant own use at about 442 petajoules a year. That's more than we use for manufacturing in Australia and more than we use for power generation. So just to run the plants to export the gas, we're using more gas than we use for manufacturing and power generation. So in a country awash with gas, with enough gas to allow the export of 80% of our gas, apparently we don't have enough gas for Australians. While this industry is always cast as Australia's gas exports, it's not really Australians exporting the gas, it's a handful of multinational oil and gas corporations. And I think that's important to remember in these contexts, because presenting gas exports as Australia's gas exports rather than the export from Australia by a handful of multinational oil and gas corporations is an important part of how these companies get their social licence. Gas exports have been an economic disaster in Australia. 15 years ago, the eastern states of Australia, where 90% of Australians live, had abundant low-cost gas. The gas price was around $3 to $4 a gigajoule. Then in around 2010, a group of global oil and gas corporations proposed 3 giant LNG terminals in Gladstone in Queensland. They built them all on this formerly pristine Curtis Island, beautiful place that's now been destroyed by these export facilities, and their dredging wiped out the fishing industry around Gladstone. It was an absolute disaster for the marine environment. These companies promised economic benefits, jobs, taxes, royalties, flow-on benefits to local businesses, cheaper energy, and all the rest of it. It was all lies. When the initial construction phase created an enormous skills shortage, and the gas industry, because they don't train anyone, they just poached skilled workers from other businesses, creating an acute skills shortages and driving up the cost for those businesses, causing many of them to close. So there was a big crowding out effect on other businesses. The more gas, the less of everything else. Once the short construction phase was finished, they drastically cut the workforce, leaving a tiny operational workforce. They're one of the smallest employing industries in Australia. You can see this slide shows a comparison of selected industries against oil and gas employment. There on the right-hand side in the small red column. So the real engine of jobs in Australia remains health, education and other services, as well as manufacturing. The health industry employs 100 times the amount of people employed in the oil and gas industry, education 50 times and manufacturing 40 times. And none of these industries bang on about how many jobs they create the way the gas industry does. There was a lot of talk about how the gas industry would have flow-on economic benefits to local industry, but they really rely on international supply chains. So, for example, the massive LNG terminals, this is a Bechtel slide. Bechtel built the 3 big terminals in Gladstone in Queensland, pointing out that they were designed in Houston, New Delhi and Shanghai, built in the Philippines, Indonesia and Thailand. Then they were floated over Australia to be bolted together. So it just contrasts with their sort of rhetoric about building things in Australia and creating jobs in Australia. In the actual gas field areas, in contrast to the industry's promises of jobs and economic benefits, the onshore gas industry feeding these big terminals had a disruptive and largely negative impact on regional communities. The government and industry actively went out to local communities advocating the benefits of gas development to get social licence. They convinced local businesses to invest in housing and equipment and to take advantage of this incoming gas boom. But then the companies just built workers' camps and bypassed local businesses, which caused devastating impacts on these local communities. So this town of Miles in the middle of the gas fields, that was their car hire yard, and it's now an empty paddock. Another example in Miles is the local community was encouraged to build whole suburbs for the gas industry to house gas industry workers, and then the gas industry just built the gas companies just built workers camps 20 kilometres down the road. So all those people lost all their money. Local businesses are usually the biggest advocates for gas development in Australia. When they were surveyed at the height of the boom, local businesses said they experienced a deterioration in all tested types of capital, including financial capital, infrastructure, labour force skills, social networks, and environment. So that's the actual business community. And when communities were surveyed, just ordinary community members were surveyed and asked how they thought gas development had changed their region, only 6% thought it had changed the region for the better. They also, their promises of royalties and taxes were massively overstated. They do pay some royalties, but Australia-wide, over half the gas exported from Australia they get for free. They don't pay any royalties. And this table shows the corporate tax not paid by all the companies exporting gas from the East Coast. So they've been operating for 10 years. They've sold close to $200 billion worth of gas, and most of them, all bar one, have paid no corporate tax to date. When these companies were trying to get their projects approved, they told the government, specifically, this is a document from one of the proponents, they told our governments that it would have no impact on gas prices, but at the same time they were presenting to investors saying that the global gas price linkage would allow them to triple the price of gas on the domestic gas they were selling into the Australian market. So they lied to governments, and even though they were at the same time they were telling investors, what their real game plan was. So here's gas prices in Australia. I've got marked the point where gas prices from the east coast of Australia started in January 2015. So gas prices tripled pretty much straight away, and then they tripled again during the global Ukraine price spike, even though Australia imports no gas. So massive price increases. And because, and I've overlaid in the orange here, wholesale electricity prices, because the cost of gas-fired generation often sets the electricity price in Australia. So electricity prices went through the roof as well. All this happened because the entire gas network's interconnected. So even gas that was going straight into to feed the domestic market that wasn't being exported, because the gas network's interconnected, those gas fields could also charge Australian customers global prices about 3 times what the former local price. Impacts didn't stop there, because that created inflation. Then the Reserve Bank of Australia raised interest rates to tackle inflation, and that added thousands of dollars annually to people's mortgages, which had an even greater impact. Manufacturing businesses closed down because of high energy prices. And the irony being, so what this slide shows is the blue bit is the amount of uncontracted gas. So gas that the companies haven't contracted for export, and they've been just exporting that to the global spot market. So it isn't gas required to fill their export contracts. They've been selling gas on the global spot market ahead of supplying Australians, partly because they can get a higher price, but also so they can keep the market tight and engineer shortages to keep prices high in Australia. And to add insult to injury, much of the gas exported to our largest customer country, Japan, is on-sold at a profit, while Australians are facing gas shortages. The problem's been completely obvious, but the Australian government's been too weak to stand up to the gas industry, and the sum total of 10 years incremental policies to try and deal with the gas crisis, according to a body called the ICCC in Australia, who are the go-to authority on gas issues. There's been 10 years of government policies have made no difference, done nothing to solve the problem. So I'll just very briefly touch on some of the environmental impacts. I know you're looking at more at shale and tight gas, but in Australia we have predominantly coal seam methane on the east coast. They dewater aquifers to depressurise the aquifers to allow the gas to migrate up, and that has huge impacts on the water table, which have been dropped up to 500 metres in some places in a country where we rely on aquifers for drinking water and agriculture. Because the coal seams have been dewatered and depressurised, methane bubbles up through fissures, old boreholes and fissures all over the place, most obviously in rivers. This is the Condamine River in Queensland, with methane bubbling up all over the place. And just in terms of the overall, this is my final slide, but just in terms of the overall emissions. So this slide, so the emissions, if you count the combustion emissions when the gas is combusted overseas, I know it's not counted in Australia, but the climate doesn't recognise international boundaries. It's about 250 million tonnes, so 250 million tonnes of emissions a year. And I've just compared that to the emissions from coal power stations in Australia in this slide, just to demonstrate the scale of the emissions from this toxic, climate-destroying industry. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark, for your presentation, and a huge thank you to all three of our speakers today for taking the time to come in and share their expertise with all of us here. So thanks very much. And now we'd love to hear from the audience and have a bit of a discussion. So we've already received some advanced questions, but I would like to point everyone to the Q&A box that should be on the bottom of your screens on the Zoom function bar. Please use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you'd like our speakers to elaborate on based on their presentations. But in the meantime, we'll start with some questions that we received in advance. So first one is, we're going to start with our speakers in the US and Australia. So you both highlighted some of the challenges that have come from LNG exports in your domestic economies and also for local communities. And the question is about which arguments against further LNG expansion in your countries that already have a significant export industry, which arguments have resonated the most with the public when you've been engaging in this type of research?
Do you want?
Either of you can start.
I can start.
You start, Shen.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to say, because I don't think that it's on most Americans' radar of why gas prices have been going up. And so there's just still a lot of education to do. I think that the gas and oil companies still have a lot of media and political power, of course, and so are able to shape the narrative quite a bit. But we are seeing Americans increasingly concerned about electricity and gas prices. And so, we are hoping that awareness will improve. And so I'd say affordability and price concerns are probably resonating the most across the country. But as I mentioned before, the disproportionate impact of pollution itself, that is affecting coastal communities, especially in the Gulf Coast. And so I think that the public health, they're living through the public health consequences. So that's very top of mind as well.
Yeah, in Australia, the thing that's actually stopped, because we actually have stopped a whole bunch of big gas development projects in Australia, so with the number of moratoriums and a fracking ban in the state of Victoria. But we had moratoriums in Western Australia, Queensland, and moratoriums in Western Australia and the Northern Territory, and a fracking ban in Queensland, and in the state of New South Wales, a whole lot of fracking projects were actually stopped. And these were stopped by local communities declaring, a whole lot of tactics, but particularly declaring regions gas field free. So just putting up signs everywhere saying that they would, that they weren't allowed to, saying they didn't want the gas industry in their regions, and building support locally and with local governments and community groups and all the rest of it. And so projects were actually stopped. Huge amounts obviously got through, given we're the third largest gas exporter in the world, but there was significant stops and delays. At the moment, people are really registering the impact on energy prices. So the gas industry is, particularly on the East Coast, the gas industry is getting absolutely slammed for causing enormous rises in gas and electricity prices. And the other thing we're finding that's a really powerful thing is, because they pay so little tax and royalties, we're really highlighting that, and people are starting to realise, what a bunch of grifters they are, and freeloaders, and I think that narrative's really having an impact in Australia. Just really emphasising that they're a bunch of global oil and gas companies who get all the benefits. They don't share the benefits. They get much of the gas for free. They avoid taxes, and they price gouge us for our own resource. And that kind of messaging, which is entirely true, entirely accurate, is proving very effective.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Mark and Shannon, for those insights. So just for everyone, I believe Shannon has had to hop off the call for a logistical appointment. So any further questions for her, for them and their presentation, will be answered by Jazia Smith here. Thank you for joining. But before we move on to more questions there, I've got one here for Ian, and that is that you alluded in your presentation to the idea of clean LNG in BC and some arguments there. I was wondering if you could provide a little more context about those claims and whether there is significant weight to them.
Yeah, sure. I know I used the air quotes when I said it, so I kind of opened up that question. So I mean, relative to the US or the Middle East, it's maybe about half. To put that like into number terms, I think LNG Canada Phase 1 is about 0.16 tons of CO2 per ton of LNG. You'd expect to be over 0.2 in the US. And then these facilities are, just to back up, LNG Canada Phase 1 is only partly electrified. But the fully electrified facilities like Cedar would be closer to about 0.04. Now, I mean, these numbers, again, don't matter a ton, but they're all relative to their competitors. So And I would say too that the reason that these facilities are relatively low on the emission scale is because of the strong policies that exist in BC specifically. They've done a lot of great work with the methane regulations, and that has eliminated a lot of the methane emissions from the upstream, which is a major source for that. And then I'd also say the OBPS, or the carbon pricing, industrial carbon pricing, has also incentivized decarbonizing the sector much more than, say, its competitors, where these policies don't exist.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for expanding a bit more there, Ian, and also for yeah, for added context, I can share from IISD's perspective there as well, that when we look at the emissions from BC's liquefaction facilities, they don't include the upstream emissions associated with increased LNG production, which of course results in increased upstream natural gas extraction, which in Canada is often particularly emissions intensive due to the processes that we use here. So thanks for that. The next question that we have is related to the first question, but with a bit more focus on government messaging. So yes, we heard about effective messaging for the public in the US and Australia, but would any of our speakers like to note what messaging they think is particularly resonant for a government audience? And this is open to anyone.
I think energy prices, the thing that governments are responding to in Australia is the impact on energy prices, and particularly when the manufacturing industry are really, really up in arms about it. I think that would have to be the main thing. But again, I think also just, and I'm not sure, what the tax regime is in Canada and the US, but highlighting how much we're getting ripped off makes the politicians look, highlights their failure to prioritise the interests of Australians over these big global oil and gas companies. And I think that's, they really, they do take that on board as well.
Yeah, and I can add to that. I mean, I was also quite drawn by the parallels from Mark's presentation about Australia to what we're seeing in Canada, and I think poking some holes in maybe the jobs and GDP benefits that are put out there by the sector itself. And I mean, hopefully our report will help or provide some ammunition that can be used to point to that there's other sectors that can offer more benefit on, again, like a per megawatt hour basis, but also just in general, that don't run the risk of causing emissions to run out of control. And again, the issue of stranded assets. I think like messaging to government officials, I think would just be pointing out the risks of LNG. Also to say that from at least a Canadian perspective, we already have 3 pretty major projects that are under construction or completed. And so, do we really need to wait to have more immediately, or should we wait and see how the market unfolds? And again, I say that from the perspective of committing substantial amounts of power that could be going to other sectors that need it now, and also to dovetail off IISD's work, when you're providing government supports, are these other sectors that you can get more bang for your buck in terms of return towards the economy.
And to quickly add on, Mark already alluded to this as well, but affordability as a issue frame remains incredibly salient for Americans here. And so CAP has recently been tracking utility bill rises and utility rate increases. Electricity bills for Americans have risen twice the rate of inflation. And Shannon alluded to this earlier in their presentation, but there's been proven studies, and both in the real world as well, with Americans' energy bills, that natural gas exports add upward pressure on bills. And so not necessarily that the carbon intensity and pollution angle is politically unhelpful because it depends on the communities you're talking to. For environmental justice communities, low-income communities of color, that remains a very salient, very relevant issue frame. But broadly, affordability, energy price spikes remain the best issue frame at the moment that we're working on.
Great. Well, that's all very interesting and I think very helpful. And then to follow up, we've got another comment in the chat following up on the clean LNG discussion that I'll just raise as a comment here to round out. John Young highlights the point that the majority of LNG emissions are combusted or come from the end-use combustion of the gas, which is another really important aspect to take into account when we're thinking about whether LNG may be clean or not, regardless of the liquefaction facilities themselves. The vast majority of emissions occur when that gas is burned, and we shouldn't overlook that. So thanks for raising that comment, John, in the discussion. Are there any other questions that we would like answered today from the audience? Because I think that is all of them that I've seen so far.
Could I just chime in quickly? I just think, so I've talked a lot about the economic impacts, but I think talking about because I was talking about saying a lot of projects were stopped in Australia. We had to argue the economic arguments, but also just the impacts on water and the climate. They're all, and pollution, like, wiping out the fish stocks in Gladstone Harbour, with dredge spoil and all of that kind of thing. All of those things were all very important as well. So I wouldn't want to, I agree with Josia, the price impacts is super important to really emphasise to people that LNG exports cause price impacts. I think it's a very resonant issue and ties into the cost of living and inflation, all the rest of it. But I think you've got to make all the arguments depending on your audience.
Yeah, that's a very important point to raise. And yeah, I should say for the audience as well, of course, the theme of today's webinar was specifically on those economic risks. I'm very glad that both Mark and Shannon went into some more of the local community oriented impact as well in their presentations, and that of course Ian's managed to touch on some of those climate arguments too for a sort of more complete discussion. But of course, there's always more to be said on any of these complicated topics. So yeah, so with that, I think I'll say thanks very much to our panelists again, and thank you, of course, to the audience, everyone who's taken the time to join our session today. It's great to see people interested in this topic. Yeah, so let's. So yes, I believe also our three speakers all shared their contact information. So if the speakers are happy, please do reach out to them afterwards. If anyone in the audience has follow-up questions that weren't addressed today in the webinar, I'm sure they would be very happy to answer. The same goes for our team here at IISD, as we'll be happy to continue this important conversation elsewhere. So as Canada considers its next steps for industrial development, we hope that research from experts like we've heard from today is taken seriously and considered as these decisions are being made actively at the moment and going forward. So with that, thanks all for the conversation and have a great day.